I'm Jack, 38. I fix-it systems from a trailer in Kentucky. The night I realized I'd won $4.5 million, I whispered, "They'll never believe this," to the wall. They didn't believe me anyway, but they burned my check before I could prove them wrong. Now, each time the magnolia rustles outside, I wonder, can something still bloom if its roots were scorched? If this story feels like a scar you've carried too long, tell me where you're listening from tonight. It was one of those mornings when the cold came in under the door before you even stepped outside. The kind of morning where your breath fogs inside the car, and everything you touch feels like metal. I stood in line at Eddie's Gas and Go, half awake, half aware, the hum of the fridge units louder than the radio playing something twangy and sad. My boots crunched on salt pellets scattered across the concrete floor. The clerk, a kid I didn't recognize, new, probably, held up the scratch-off booklet. "You want to add the power play?" he asked, tapping the plastic screen. I looked up from my phone. Another group text from the family, some photo of Amber's dog in a Halloween costume. 37 messages before this one. Not a single one directed to me. "Sure," I said. "Why not? Maybe if I win, they'll finally text me back something other than requests." The clerk didn't laugh. He just nodded, rang me up, and handed me the ticket like it was a receipt for windshield washer fluid. Back in the truck, the heater coughed. I let it idle while I sat there, staring out across the 2-lane road. That gas station had been there my whole life. So had the silence. I drove home without turning on the radio. My place isn't much. A rust-colored trailer with weak insulation and a back step that groans every time I step on it. But it's mine. I work IT support from my kitchen table, surrounded by mugs that never quite make it back to the sink, and windows that overlook nothing but dry grass and a half-dead magnolia tree. It used to bloom. I remember that. Spring mornings when Mom would point to it and say, "See? That's how we know things are turning again." But it stopped blooming around the same time I stopped being her boy, somewhere between my first unpaid rent and Amber's first promotion. The day passed like most others. Logged into the help desk system, answered questions from strangers, fixed problems they caused themselves. The hum of the space heater under my chair was the only sound besides my keyboard. I made dinner around 7, if you could call microwaved chili dinner. Sat with it in front of the TV, channel flipped until nothing looked new, and then let the screen go dark. That's when I remembered the ticket. I didn't make a show of it. I didn't even stand up. I reached for my coat on the hook, pulled the slip from the inside pocket, and opened the state lottery website on my phone. The numbers loaded slow. Rural signal. Figures. I read them once, then again. My chest didn't pound. My eyes didn't widen. I said, "No way." Then I laughed, but it wasn't a joyful kind of sound. More like the wheeze you let out when you realize your shoe's been untied for a mile. $4.5 million. I stared at the numbers, then at the ticket, then at the magnolia outside, its branches sharp like bones against the moonlight. "They'll never believe this," I said to no one. And I meant it. Not just because I don't usually win things, but because even if I told them, they'd still find a way to make it about Amber, or money I owed, or things I hadn't done. I stood up slowly. No rush. No excitement. I lifted the edge of the hallway rug and pried up the loose floorboard I'd noticed months ago but never fixed, slid the ticket underneath, pressed the wood back down, and stepped on it twice. Like a ritual. Then I went back to the table and reopened my laptop. Same support queue, same usernames, same tasks. You'd think something would change in that moment. You'd think my shoulders would rise, or my spine would straighten. But nothing did. I still sat the same way, still drank the same warm soda from this morning. Later that night, lying in bed, I scrolled aimlessly. Watched videos of people laughing, proposing, celebrating. I thought about how none of them looked like they were alone when they won. I fell asleep sometime before midnight, the kind of sleep that doesn't rest anything, just knocks the edge off the day. The next morning my phone buzzed with a voicemail. Mom's voice filled the kitchen. "Amber's got something exciting to tell you. Call us back, honey." She didn't sound curious about my weekend. Didn't sound like she even knew I'd called at all last week, because I hadn't. And she hadn't noticed. The magnolia outside still hadn't moved, still bare, still frozen in its own silence. Sunday evenings always held a strange weight in that house, like the walls remembered the arguments better than the laughter. I pulled into the driveway of my parents' split-level home just after dusk. Amber's car, a brand-new hybrid, was already parked out front, gleaming beneath the porch light like it belonged there more than I did. Inside, the air smelled like rosemary chicken and expensive candles. Voices buzzed from the kitchen. Mom's high-pitched laugh, Amber's performative excitement, and Dennis's deep, coach-like tone. No one noticed me stepping through the door. I hung my coat on the same peg I used in high school, still marked with a crack from the time I slammed it too hard junior year. No, "Hey, Jack," or "Glad you made it." Just the noise of celebration I wasn't part of. Mom swept past me, carrying a tray of wine glasses. "Jack," she said without stopping, "grab the green beans from the counter, will you?" I nodded. That was the only greeting I got. At the table, Amber sparkled in a cream blouse, talking about venue options and color palettes like she was reading from a lifestyle blog. Dennis nodded like a good fiancé. He was tall, loud, and somehow managed to talk about mortgages like they were romantic. "We're thinking a vineyard," he said, raising his glass. "Something classy but not pretentious." "Oh, honey," Mom cooed, "you two are just perfect." I was seated at the far end of the table, past Uncle Ray's old chair that no one sat in anymore. The good plates were out, the fireplace crackled, and above it, the mantel groaned under the weight of Amber's trophies. Cheerleading, debate, something from college I didn't understand. Not a single photo of me. Not even the school portrait I'd given Mom in 10th grade. Dinner moved quickly. Toasts were made. Mom teared up twice. I said little, chewed slower than I needed to. Between bites, Amber turned to me with a familiar smirk. "If you ever make it big, Jack," she said, nudging Dennis, "remember who changed your diapers?" Laughter. I chuckled too, just enough to pass. Inside, my jaw clenched. I could feel the folded slip of paper in my pocket, the ticket, like it was heating up. Mom, refilling Amber's wine glass, beamed. "You always knew what you wanted, sweetheart." The words passed through me like static. After dinner, I slipped away to the hallway, pretending to check a text that never came. The laughter dimmed behind me. I made the mistake of pausing near the old photo wall. Amber's prom, Amber's graduation, Amber at the beach, and between two dusty frames, an empty hook where my picture used to hang. "Jack," Mom's voice came soft behind me, hand on my elbow. She led me to the kitchen, just the two of us now. The light above the stove flickered. Her tone shifted from festive to coaxing. "Amber's wedding is going to be lovely," she said. "But, well, it's expensive, and I know things haven't always been fair. But if you ever come into money—" She placed a hand gently on my arm. "Think about your family." I didn't move, didn't blink. "I always think about my family," I said. "Maybe more than they think about me." Her smile flickered. "That's not fair, Jack." But it was. I nodded like I agreed anyway. then turned and walked out before she could say anything else. Outside, the night air hit colder than it had any right to in October. The stars looked like strangers. I got in the truck and sat there for a minute, gripping the wheel, letting the silence fill me. That ticket, still in my pocket, felt heavier than before, like it wasn't just numbers on paper, but a truth I couldn't unlearn. Money didn't change people. It revealed them. I didn't say goodbye. Back at the trailer, I poured a glass of water I didn't drink and sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall. The ticket stayed under the floorboard. Later, when sleep didn't come, I opened the drawer of the desk in my childhood room, something I hadn't done in years. Under old notepads and expired pens, I found a photo. Me and Amber, side by side in second grade. She was grinning with a missing tooth. I was holding a paper turkey. Someone had drawn a red X across my face. I didn't remember doing it. I didn't remember anyone doing it. I put the photo back and closed the drawer slowly. Outside, the magnolia tree didn't move. The hum of my monitor filled the room like static. Lines of code scrolled endlessly across the screen, but my mind wasn't on the screen. It kept looping one line, like a corrupted audio file. If you ever come into money? Mom's voice hadn't sounded greedy, just casual, like asking me to pass the butter. But the words had burrowed deep. Every time I blinked, I saw her standing in the yellow light of the kitchen, her eyes soft and expectant. Not loving. Not really. Expectant. I pushed my glasses up, leaned back, and let the chair creak under my weight. The air in the trailer was still. The magnolia tree outside my window looked even more brittle today, a collection of frozen fingers scraping the gray sky. My desk was cluttered. Empty mugs, a wrinkled invoice, a cracked mouse pad from an old conference in Tampa. My place was always like that. Lived in, but not alive. A Zoom ping pulled me back. I clicked accept. "Tessa," I said, trying not to sound too relieved. Her face filled the screen, a halo of frizzy dark hair and glasses that always slid down her nose. She looked up from a coffee mug the size of a soup bowl. "You look like you haven't slept in a week," she said. "Don't tell me you're still debugging that back-end loop." "Just about finished," I lied. She raised a brow. "They still ignoring you?" I smirked. "Only when they're not asking for something." Tessa sighed, long and theatrical. "You know, someday they're gonna regret not knowing what they had in you." I didn't answer. Not because I disagreed, but because I didn't want to lie again. She meant well. Always had. Ever since we got paired on a project last year, she'd been the only person I looked forward to seeing, even if only on a screen. "Want to grab coffee next time you're in New York?" she asked, casual like always. "Sure," I said. "If I ever get on a plane again?" She laughed. "Fair enough. Well, I gotta jump. Dev call in 5. Don't code yourself into a coma." And just like that, the screen went dark again. The silence came back fast. I turned back to the code but couldn't focus. My hand drifted unconsciously to the jar beside my bed, a clear glass thing I'd once used for spare change. Now it held only one item: the folded lottery ticket. Not hidden. Not displayed. Just kept. Like a relic. I stared at it for a long time. Then I opened my browser and typed, "Can you claim lottery winnings anonymously in Kentucky?" The search engine spun. No, that was the gist. Kentucky required public disclosure. Name, amount, possibly even a press release. I scrolled deeper, clicking forums, law blogs, conspiracy threads. One guy said he used a trust. Another said his cousin claimed through a LLC and moved out of state. Most replies were garbage. I shut the laptop and leaned forward, elbows on knees. My breath fogged the glass jar slightly. It looked like I was exhaling my doubt. If I tell them, They'll expect everything. If I don't, I'm the villain. There was no version of this where I didn't become someone else in their eyes, either the savior or the selfish one. Neither sounded right. I pulled out a manila envelope from the drawer, slid in a blank receipt I printed online, and wrote across it in pen. Claimed, not redeemed. It was fake, pointless, but it calmed something in me, gave shape to the fog. The next step was obvious. I looked up the address of the state lottery office. It was a 2-hour drive. I could be there and back before dinner. I didn't pack anything. I didn't tell anyone. I just set my alarm for early the next day. That night, I laid down, the jar still beside me like a nightlight I couldn't admit I needed. Somewhere past midnight, my phone lit up with a voicemail. Amber. I stared at the screen a while before playing it. Hey, Jack. Mom said something about you acting weird lately. Everything okay? She didn't sound concerned. She sounded annoyed, like I'd interrupted her day by existing in a way she hadn't approved. I deleted the voicemail. Outside, the wind knocked gently against the windows, but the magnolia didn't move. Not even a shiver. The country club sat on a hill that didn't belong to people like me. It rose above the rest of town like it had something to prove. I parked my old truck between a Lexus and a BMW and waited a full 5 minutes before turning the key off. In the silence, I could hear my own breath. Inside, everything gleamed. Polished wood floors, chandeliers made to impress, not to comfort. Waiters in white jackets floated around with silver trays, and the air smelled like money and lavender. I pulled at the collar of my button-down, one I hadn't worn since Amber's college graduation. It pinched at the neck. I didn't belong here, and everyone knew it the moment I stepped in. Amber spotted me first. "Jack," she chirped, arms outstretched like she'd just spotted a long-lost puppy. "You clean up nice, sort of." Dennis laughed like he'd rehearsed it. I gave a half smile and nodded. "You made it," Mom said, appearing behind them with a glass of something pink in her hand. She looked me up and down but didn't comment. Instead, she turned to the couple beside her. "This is Dennis, my future son-in-law, the son I always wanted." I blinked. She said it without malice, without awareness, like it was just a fact. The couple laughed politely. Dennis shook another hand. Amber beamed. I adjusted my sleeves and found my way to the far corner near the buffet, where the shrimp cocktail didn't judge me. A woman in a pearl necklace approached, sipping from a glass flute. "Are you in finance too?" she asked, gesturing toward Dennis. I shook my head. "No, just the IT guy." She laughed, short and sharp, then walked away before I could clarify. I wasn't sure if she thought I was joking, or beneath explanation. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of polite conversations I wasn't part of. Toasts, speeches. One of Amber's friends cried. Another gave a slideshow of their engagement photos. Sunsets, vineyards, rings held up to the light. Then came the mic. Amber tapped it with a practiced poise. "We just want to thank everyone for being here. It means the world to us, and I especially want to thank my big brother Jack for showing up tonight." She turned to me with a grin that didn't reach her eyes. "If Jack hits the jackpot, I call dibs." The room erupted in laughter. I didn't laugh. My ears buzzed. My hands clenched. Somewhere in my pocket, my keys dug into my thigh, grounding me. I looked at Mom. She smiled. At Dennis, he chuckled. Nobody saw my face go pale. They didn't know. And in that moment, I realized they wouldn't believe me, even if I told them. They'd turn it into a joke, a favor, a debt. They'd already decided who I was, and no amount of money could change it. I didn't stay for cake, didn't say goodbye. I stepped out into the night, the air cooler now. The club's floodlights made everything sharp. Trees casting long shadows, laughter echoing behind me like a language I never learned. I sat in the truck and didn't start it. Across the lawn, a magnolia tree swayed gently in the breeze, its branches full but colorless under the artificial light. There was something almost cruel in how pretty it looked, something pretending to be alive. "I hope you never know," I whispered. "I hope none of you ever know." Back home, I didn't turn on the lights. I walked straight to the nightstand, unscrewed the lid of the glass jar, and pulled the ticket out. It was warm from the heat of my palm, delicate and dangerous all at once. For the first time, I held it with both hands. "This isn't for them," I said, voice low, steady. Not revenge, not power, just clarity. In the quiet, I realized something else. The only person I needed to prove anything to was sitting in this room. Me. I folded the ticket again, slower this time, and placed it under the pillow. Like a truth I was finally ready to sleep beside. The Kentucky Lottery Commission building looked more like a dentist's office than the portal to life-changing fortune. Beige walls, faded flags, and a front desk with an artificial plant that hadn't been dusted in a while. It was quiet. Too quiet. Just the faint buzz of fluorescent lights and a soft click as the receptionist's nails tapped her keyboard. I stood in line behind a woman with a scratch-off ticket and a toddler clinging to her leg. My heart pounded, not from excitement, but from something closer to nausea. The envelope under my arm held every required document, sealed twice over. My driver's license, a copy of the winning ticket, a freshly opened bank account number. The woman ahead finished and left with $20 and a smile. My turn. I stepped forward, cleared my throat. "I have a claim." The receptionist didn't blink. "Big win?" I slid the envelope across. "I'd like to speak with someone privately." She raised an eyebrow but didn't press. "One moment." A few minutes later, I found myself in a carpeted office with walls the color of oatmeal and a window that overlooked nothing. The man across from me wore a tie that screamed 1994 and a grin that hadn't moved in a decade. "Tommy Ray," he said, extending a hand. "Public relations?" I shook it. "So," he said, flipping through my papers. "Jack, well, wow, this is a big one." I nodded. 4.5 million before taxes. You play often?" "Not really," I said. "Bought it on a whim." Tommy chuckled. "That's usually how it goes." He tapped the envelope, then looked up. "Most folks bring family with them for this part. You came alone?" "It's better that way." His smile faltered for a split second. Then the PR grin snapped back on. "Well, privacy's your right, of course, but you'll have to pose for a photo for our records. Just a small thing." "I'd rather not." "We encourage it. Public transparency and all." I shook my head. "Not today." He didn't push, just made a note in his folder and nodded. 15 minutes later, it was done. I sat in that oatmeal-colored chair holding a check so thick it didn't feel real. My name typed cleanly across the top. $4,500,000. In bold print. The zeros stared back at me like eyes. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like holding fire. I forced myself to breathe. Tommy walked me to the door, still chatting about tax brackets and how some winners buy new houses the same day. I smiled when he did. I nodded when I should. In the parking lot, I paused beside my truck. There, just off to the right of the exit, stood a withered magnolia tree. Same peeling bark, same lifeless branches, different soil, same death. I stared at it too long. Back in the truck, I slid the check into a plain manila folder, tucked it behind the seat, and drove straight to a bank across town I'd never used before. The teller didn't blink as I handed it over. She just smiled and asked if I'd like coffee while I waited. No, I said. I'm fine. The funds went into a new account. Private, clean, no linked phone numbers, no family names. I set up a new email just for bank alerts and wrote the password on a scrap of paper I immediately burned in my kitchen sink that night. Then I did nothing. I didn't buy a new car, I didn't quit my job, I didn't even upgrade my Wi-Fi. I went home, folded laundry, reheated leftover chili, and stared at the wall for 3 hours. Wealth, it turns out, doesn't make the air feel lighter. It makes every silence louder. At midnight, my phone buzzed. Amber. Hey. Mom said you looked upset at the party. You okay? Also, have a crazy idea. Can I call you? No period at the end. Just that trailing, casual, familiar tone. Like nothing had changed. Like she hadn't humiliated me in front of strangers. Like we were still those kids in the backyard digging holes, pretending we were pirates. I didn't respond. Not yet. I stared at the text until the screen dimmed, then locked the phone and slid it under the mattress. I turned off the light and lay back. Outside the window, the magnolia tree stood just as it had yesterday. Bare, broken, but still rooted. So was I. I was sitting on the trailer steps, a chipped coffee mug warming my palms, when the phone rang. The sun was just beginning to fall behind the ridge, turning the sky a worn-out pink. Magnolia petals, brown and thin as onion skin, drifted down one by one, catching the light before landing softly on the dirt. I let it ring twice before answering. Hey, I said. Amber's voice was bright. Too bright. Jack, I was just thinking about you. How's everything? You still doing all that computer stuff? I exhaled a quiet smile. Still hacking into the Pentagon daily. She laughed. Don't get caught. Seriously though, how are you? I leaned back, watched a petal land on the toe of my boot. I'm okay. Okay sounds vague, she said lightly. Okay is honest. She hummed in response, then went quiet for a second too long. I knew that pause, the one where sweetness gave way to something stickier. Well, she started, it's kind of awkward, but Dennis and I hit a little hiccup with the wedding. Here it came. The venue wants full payment early. It's nothing crazy, just... She trailed off. I didn't interrupt. I wanted her to say it, to own it. So, she continued, I just thought, if you ever came into money, like something random, something crazy like winning the lottery or whatever, well, you'd help family, right? The silence between us stretched, long and taut. I looked down at the crushed petals under my heel, then up at the sky turning from gold to gray. Amber, I said slowly, I didn't win the lottery. There was another pause, then a laugh, soft and airy. Of course not, I was just joking. God, Jack, you're so serious sometimes. I smiled with my mouth, but not with my eyes. Guess I am. We talked another minute or two. Weather, work, Dennis's new promotion. Then she said, well, I'll let you go, like she was doing me a favor. We hung up without any mention of seeing each other. The line went dead. The wind shifted. I stared at the tree in the yard, the same one that never fully bloomed, and reached out to pluck one of its leaves. It came off easy, brittle between my fingers. I tore it in half. It felt like something breaking, but not loudly. That night, I drove 2 counties over to avoid the local post office. Walked into a gas station and asked for a money order. $500. No name. I folded it into an envelope, wrote Amber's address on the front, and in the corner, from someone who still remembers. No return address. 2 days later, she texted. Some kind angel just helped us out. Seriously, who even does that anymore? I stared at the message. My thumbs hovered. Then I locked the phone and slid it into the drawer beneath my socks. It felt good for about a second. Then it felt like nothing. Later that week, my phone buzzed again. This time, a call. Mom. I let it go to voicemail. Her voice was low, a little too calm. Jack, we need to talk. In person. Sunday dinner. No please, no explanation. Just another expectation wrapped in pleasantry. I put the phone down, pressed my fingers together tight. Outside, the magnolia tree shed another handful of leaves. I thought of the one I'd torn in half, now curling brown on the porch. Another piece gone. The front door was already open when I pulled into the driveway. Inside, the house smelled like fried chicken and lemon-scented cleaner. Ruth's way of saying this wasn't a war zone, it was Sunday dinner. Amber waved from the couch, legs crossed neatly, sipping sweet tea like it was summer, and not the wreckage of something more permanent. "Hey, stranger," she called. I nodded. My voice stayed somewhere in my throat. Ruth emerged from the kitchen, apron still on. "Dinner's almost ready," she said, like we'd just finished church, like I hadn't ignored her call for days. At the table, the small talk was louder than usual. Dennis bragged about a new client. Amber laughed too loudly. Ruth passed the mashed potatoes like she hadn't torched the ground beneath my feet earlier in the week. I chewed slowly, smiled when required. Waited. After dinner, I slipped out to the garage. The air smelled of oil and grass clippings, stale but quieter than the house. I stood by the workbench, palms pressed to the cool wood, eyes on the faded calendar from 2017 still tacked to the wall. I heard her footsteps before I turned. Ruth stood there, holding a piece of paper in her hand. She didn't speak right away, just extended it toward me. I took it. A photocopy. Grainy and slanted but unmistakable. The lottery check. $4.5 million. My name. Blurred but readable. "I found it," she said flatly. "In the mail. I thought maybe it was junk. Then I read the numbers." I said nothing. "You lied to us," she went on. "You shamed this family, kept secrets, made us look like beggars." "It wasn't for you," I said. Her eyes narrowed. "Then it's for no one." She turned and walked back inside. I followed, something cold moving down my spine. In the living room, the fireplace had been lit. Fake logs, real flame. She stood before it, holding something new now. The original check. Not the copy. "No," I said quietly. She looked me in the eye. "You think you're better than us now? You think money makes you more?" "Don't," I whispered. She didn't blink. She held the check over the flame. Amber stepped into the doorway. Her eyes found mine, then the check. Her lips parted. No words came. The check caught like dry leaves, orange at the edges. Then gone. Ruth stood there, hand empty, watching the last of it curl into ash. No one spoke. I didn't scream. I didn't grab her wrists or dig through the ashes. I turned. Walked out. My eyes burned, but not from smoke. In the car, I didn't think. I just drove. Past the county line, past the gas station where I first bought the ticket, past the banks and billboards and streetlights. At some point, I tossed my phone, burner, new, temporary, into a river I couldn't name. Watched the ripple fan out and disappear. By dawn, I'd reached an old roadside motel off Route 9. Neon vacancy flickering like a dying heartbeat. I parked under a crooked tree, walked into the front office, and asked for a room. "Name?" the clerk asked. "John C.," I said. She handed me the key to room 4. I didn't ask why that one, just took it. Outside, near the back fence, a magnolia tree stood full in bloom, its petals soft, white, wide open to the morning light. I stared at it longer than I meant to. How it bloomed despite the gravel, despite the dust, despite the nowhere place it had been planted. I checked in without bags. No toothbrush, No clothes, no plan, just silence. And ash. I stared at the cracked ceiling above the motel bed. The fan spun lazily, clicking once every third rotation. Room 4 smelled like old linen and lemon cleaner, but for the first time in, weeks, maybe years, the silence didn't bother me. I wasn't hiding. I was unplugging, reclaiming. Outside, the magnolia tree rustled, its blossoms wide as dinner plates. I'd caught myself watching it every morning, somehow thriving out here in the dust, beside a fence no one painted. That afternoon, I popped the trunk of my car. I wasn't sure why. Habit, maybe. A need to see something familiar. Amid spare cables and old receipts, I found a black notebook. The cover was curled, the elastic band stretched thin. I opened it slowly. Inside were sketches, flowcharts, notes from another life. Pages filled with designs for a productivity app I started building back when I still believed ideas meant something, even if no one clapped for them. There were margin scribbles, too, quotes I'd copied down. Be so good they can't ignore you. Success is silent. Fame is noise. I sat in the driver's seat with the book on my lap and didn't move for a while. I could feel something shifting. Not joy, not grief, just air, clearing. My phone buzzed. Tessa. I debated letting it ring, but answered. Jack? She said. Her voice sounded smaller through cheap motel reception. Yeah. You dropped off the map. I texted, called. You okay? I looked at the tree again. I'm fine, I said. Just unplugging. Silence, then a breath from her end. Okay, let me know if you need anything, yeah? I will. She didn't believe me, but she didn't push either. That's why I trusted her. After we hung up, I pulled the curtain closed and powered up my old laptop. It booted slow. Like it too, wasn't sure it still had purpose. Then the screen flickered to life. I opened a code editor. Fingers paused above the keyboard. Then, without thinking, I typed the first line of code I had in months. Then another, and another. I didn't write a plan, didn't sketch a brand or pitch deck. I just built, not walls, not barriers, but something new, something quiet. By midnight, I had the skeleton of a working prototype, not perfect, but breathing. I leaned back. The motel chair creaked. My shoulders didn't feel as heavy. I didn't need applause, didn't need to prove anything. This was mine. I registered a new LLC the next morning under a borrowed name. No connections to Jack, no public face, anonymous by design. I wasn't disappearing. I was choosing. Later, I passed the motel clerk on my way back from the vending machine. She leaned over the counter, eyeing the sun through the glass. That magnolia out there, she said, been growing since the 60s. Storms knock it down, freeze kills its buds, but it comes back, every year. I looked at her, then at the petals pressed against the window like quiet witnesses. Won't die no matter what, she added. I nodded. Yeah, I noticed. That night I checked my inbox. A new message, no sender name, just a subject line. I know what you did. I stared at it, didn't open it, didn't delete it either. Outside the tree swayed, unbothered. The coffee shop was quiet. Just the low hum of an espresso machine and the faint sound of a blues guitar track coming through the ceiling speakers. I sat at the corner table, laptop open, but the screen barely registered. My eyes were on the email. You didn't really think they wouldn't find out, did you? No sender, no signature, no timestamp even. Just those words. I read them 5 times. I thought I was invisible, thought I'd burned enough bridges to make smoke screens, but someone was still watching. I closed the laptop gently, like shutting a door on a conversation I wasn't ready to have. 2 towns away from everything I used to call home, I was rebuilding life under an alias. Freelance work was steady, enough to pay for the motel, for coffee, for quiet. Tessa didn't know where I was. Not exactly. We talked sometimes. Zoom, mostly. That afternoon, she called. Her face flickered onto the screen. Bright, familiar. The only thread still connecting me to who I'd been. "You okay, Jack?" she asked. "You seem like you're waiting for a storm." I looked down at the tabletop, fingers drumming without rhythm. Maybe I am. She waited for more. I gave her silence. She didn't press, just said, "Call me if you need anything," and signed off. I watched the screen go dark and wished I could reach through it, not for comfort, but for grounding. Later that evening, I sat in the motel parking lot, windows rolled halfway down. The magnolia tree near the fence was losing petals again, white flecks scattered on dry asphalt like soft snow. My burner phone buzzed. Voicemail. I let it go to message. When I finally played it back, the voice was male, calm, calculated. "Mr. C, this is Evan Phillips with the Louisville Chronicle. We've heard about the check, the fire. I'd like to give you the chance to tell your side. Call me back." I hit delete before he finished the number. I didn't want to tell my side. I didn't want headlines or sympathy or some long-winded article about broken families and big money. I wanted air, new air. By dawn, I was driving east toward Bardstown. I'd found a cottage online, tiny, wooden, tucked behind a thicket of pines near a creek that hadn't been mapped in years. Cash-only rental. No questions asked. When I arrived, the air smelled like pine needles and chimney soot. No neighbors, no mailboxes, just gravel under tires and the faint call of crows. I stepped onto the porch and saw it. A note, taped to the front door with black electrical tape. Traitors never stay hidden. No name, just a crooked scrawl. My chest didn't tighten. It hollowed. I stepped inside the cottage slowly. Lock clicked behind me. The windows were small but covered with thick curtains. No TV, no Wi-Fi, just walls. And quiet. I unpacked what little I brought. Clothes, laptop, the magnolia cutting I'd saved from the motel. The stem had browned a little in transit, but I planted it anyway, behind the cabin near the edge of the woods. My fingers pressed soil into place. The air was cool, and the earth was loose. I stood there a while, hands dirty, watching the young branch tremble in the wind. I didn't speak, didn't curse or panic or dig up roots. I let the silence hold me. Not all fights have noise. Some rebellions bloom without anyone watching. I read the note again. Traitors never stay hidden. Still no signature. Still no return address. Just slanted handwriting and that distinct aftertaste of someone who believed they were owed something. Fear wasn't the first thing I felt. It was bitterness. Heavy. Familiar. Like a coat I thought I'd outgrown. I tossed the paper into the fireplace and didn't bother lighting a match. Let it sit there. Let it stare at me, same way Amber used to. Wide-eyed, innocent, and cruel without knowing it. Outside, the magnolia sapling bent in the breeze. I watched it from the kitchen window, steam rising from my chipped mug of coffee. A new bud had formed near the top. Small, almost invisible, but alive. That morning I couldn't shake a memory. One I didn't ask for. One that had been waiting, quiet beneath the surface. I was 9, Amber 7. We were in the living room fighting over a game. Connect 4 or Trouble, I think. She knocked the board over when she started losing. Ruth came in, apron on, hair in rollers. Amber said, "Jack cheated." And Ruth didn't even ask. She just looked at me and said, "If you just learned to give a little, you'd be loved more." I remember that sentence more clearly than the smell of her perfume. More than my father's voice. It burrowed deep. I stood there in the kitchen now, years and lifetimes later, hearing it again. If you just learn to give a little, I whispered. I did give. Everything. Nobody heard me. That was the point. Later that day, I pulled a legal pad from my backpack and sat on the porch. No Wi-Fi, no noise, just birds and wind and the occasional rustle of dry leaves. And I started writing. Not an email, not a will, a letter. I didn't address it to anyone in particular. I didn't plan to send it. But the words came anyway. You burned the check because I said no, but you burned me first. Years ago, when you called my boundaries selfish, when you made my silence a crime, when you let her smile be my sentence. My handwriting grew messier the more I wrote. Lines slanted, ink pooled. Somewhere in the middle of the page, the tears started. Not big, sobbing ones. Just quiet drops that blurred a few words. I wasn't crying out of regret. I was crying because truth has weight. And for the first time in a long while, I was setting it down. I finished the letter around dusk, folded it once, walked to the back of the cabin where the magnolia sapling stretched up in slow defiance. I dug a shallow hole with my hands and buried the letter there. Not as a message, not as a curse, but as a record. A confession to no one but the dirt. That night, as I sat by the window with the lights off, watching moonlight pour across the wooden floor, I felt something shift inside me. Not joy, not relief, but clarity. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't cruel. I'd been told too many times that staying silent meant peace. But silence was a scream in another language, and I had screamed long enough. The next morning I checked the mailbox by the edge of the gravel road. I'd nearly forgotten it existed. One envelope sat inside. No return address, just heavy paper, and my full name printed in clean serif font. Regarding the estate of your late father? I stood there for a long moment, letter in hand, magnolia behind me, not yet blooming, but close. The letter trembled slightly in my hand, not from the wind, but from me. Regarding the estate of your late father. I hadn't seen him in over 2 years. I hadn't known he was gone. I drove into town with hands that couldn't stay still. The gravel road seemed longer than I remembered, narrower, like they were holding their breath with me. The law office sat in an old brick building with green shutters and a faded sign that read, Wexler, Harlow, and Tate. I walked in. The receptionist didn't ask who I was. She just said, "They're expecting you," and pointed down the hall. Inside, the lawyer looked like a painting in a frame that hadn't been dusted. Tie too wide, glasses too thick, and an expression that tried hard to be warm. "Mr. Callan," he said, standing, extending a hand. "I'm Alan Tate." I shook it, weakly. He gestured to a worn leather chair. I sat. "I won't take much of your time," he began. "Your father's estate was modest." He flipped through a thin folder. "There is no cash, no trust, no investments." My throat stayed dry. "But," he continued, "he insisted one asset go solely to you, not jointly, not to be sold, not to be discussed." He slid over a key. Old brass, cold to the touch. "The fishing cabin near Panther Creek," he said. "You know the one?" I nodded slowly. I hadn't seen it since I was 17. Tate added, voice low, "Your father was complicated. This was the only thing he specified in the will as unquestionably Jack's." I stared at the key. "Did he say why?" Tate looked at me, half smiling. He said, "Jack will understand someday." That hit harder than I expected. I left without small talk. The cabin took an hour to reach. The road there was unpaved, the mailbox long gone. Trees leaned in from both sides, branches brushing against my truck like they were trying to keep me out, or pull me back in. When I reached the clearing, the cabin stood just as I remembered. Gray wood, slouched porch, windows clouded with dust. But it hadn't collapsed. Not yet. The door creaked open with one push. It smelled like old cedar and lake air, like bait boxes and damp newspapers, like memories I thought I'd left behind. On the kitchen table, covered in a thin layer of dust, sat a worn envelope. For Jack, written in my father's jagged hand. Inside was a single page. I should have done more. I should have stopped her. I didn't. I'm sorry. That was it. No date, no explanation. Just 7 words, written in uneven strokes, like he couldn't decide if he had the right to say them. I read it once. Then again. It didn't undo anything. But it stitched, not with thread, but with truth. I stood in that cabin, silence pressing in from every corner, and I finally let go of the breath I'd been holding since I was a boy. That night, I didn't drive back to Bardstown. I stayed. The bed creaked. The sheets smelled like dry wood. The air was cool and the moonlight came in through the cracks in the shutters. But I slept. No tossing. No images of fire. No imagined voices. Just sleep. The kind you only get when you stop needing to be right and start needing to be free. When I woke, the sun was coming up. Light spilled across the floor in long golden lines. Outside the window, near the edge of the lake, a magnolia tree stood half hidden among weeds. It was smaller than I remembered, but it was there, still growing. I boiled water on the old stove and poured coffee into a chipped mug that must have been my father's. It had a base fish on the front and a crack down the handle. I didn't flinch when my phone buzzed. Amber. First time in weeks. Can we meet? I think we should talk. I stared at the message, then looked out the window again. The magnolia shifted slightly in the breeze. The diner hadn't changed. Same sticky vinyl booths, same flickering overhead light that buzzed just loud enough to make silence uncomfortable. The kind of place where teenagers came after football games and old men nursed coffee like penance. Amber sat across from me in the corner booth, fingers tracing the rim of her glass. Sweet tea. Always sweet tea. She didn't smile when I walked in, just looked up with a breath that said more than any greeting. I slid into the booth, nodded once. You picked the place? She gave a half shrug. We used to come here after church. I looked around. Yeah, I remember. Neither of us mentioned that I stopped going before I turned 15. For a few minutes, we talked about nothing. Weather, gas prices, how small the town still felt, even though the new subdivision added 3 stoplights and a Dollar General. Then Amber leaned in, voice lower. I didn't know Jack. I looked at her, one brow raised. She swallowed hard. About the check, about Mom. I didn't know what she'd done until days later. I stayed quiet. Let her fill the silence with truth. Or try to. When I found out, I was horrified. I asked her, and she said she was protecting the family. That you were going to disappear on us anyway. I didn't respond. Not right away. Because I wasn't sure she was wrong about that last part. Amber went on, more to herself than to me. I thought you were just being cold again. You always shut down. I figured it was your way of punishing us. Why now? I asked, finally. Her hands tightened around the glass. Because I couldn't look you in the eye until I stopped pretending. I needed to grow up, stop playing golden. That word sat heavy between us. Golden. She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. Slid it across the table without flair or ceremony. Inside was a bank draft. $20,000. I sold some of my jewelry, and Dennis's bike. He doesn't know yet, she added with a faint smile. It's not enough. But it's what I can give. I didn't touch the envelope. Instead, I looked at her. Really looked at her. She wasn't the girl who scribbled over my face in photo albums. Not quite. Her eyes were softer now. Not in guilt. Not even an apology. Just tired. Honest. "You know I'm not taking that," I said gently. "I know," she whispered, "but I needed to offer it." For a second, I considered standing up and leaving. It would have been easier. Familiar. But I didn't. I stayed. I stayed in that booth. I stayed in her presence. And for the first time in years, we let silence exist without turning it into punishment. She talked about the wedding, how it wasn't happening anymore, how she realized it wasn't love, just convenience dressed up in diamond, how Mom called her a fool and Dennis called her selfish. "You were right," she said quietly. "Money makes people honest and cruel." "I wasn't trying to prove anything," I said. "I just couldn't carry them anymore." "I know." We didn't hug, we didn't cry, but when we stood to leave, I noticed something on the chain around her neck. A charm. Tiny. Silver. A magnolia. It caught the light just as she turned to walk out. Back at the cabin, I sat on the porch until dusk. The light turned syrupy and warm, the kind that made even the shadows seem soft. I thought about her. Not as a sister, but as someone trying, finally, to be something else. I went inside, not expecting anything, not hoping. But when I opened the old red toolbox that belonged to my father, buried under a pile of rusted screws and fishing lures, I found it. Another envelope. Yellowed, edges curled, ink faded but legible. "If you're reading this," it began, "I was wrong too." The letter rested on my lap like it had a heartbeat of its own. Outside, the late autumn wind rolled through the trees, pulling the scent of distant firewood into the porch air. I sat still on the old rocking chair, my hands unmoving, eyes locked on the folded paper. It had been 3 days since I found it. 3 days of ignoring its presence like a ghost at the table, always there, always waiting. I hadn't opened it. Not because I feared what it might say, but because I feared what it wouldn't. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled in the stove, but it wasn't enough to silence the memory of that fire. The one in the garage. The hiss of paper catching, the flare of orange light, the sound of Ruth's voice. "You lied to us. You shamed us." The check had curled like a dry leaf in her hand before the flames took it. Amber watched. Nobody moved. Nobody stopped her. That night still smelled like betrayal. Now, here I was, holding the final words of the one man who might have stopped it all, if he ever had the will. I unfolded the letter slowly, as if it might dissolve. "Jack, I won't use your time with apologies. We both know I gave too few of those when it might have mattered. But I'll say this, she lit the match, but I stacked the wood." I stopped reading. The fire inside the stove popped. "You were right to leave. I just wish I'd had the spine to follow. You reminded me of my father. Quiet, stubborn, decent. I should have protected that more." No signature, just that last sentence. I should have protected that more. I stared at the page, then the fire. I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel closure. I just felt weight. Not the kind that crushes, but the kind that finally stops floating. I stood, took the letter, and opened the stove door. The warmth hit my face. One breath, then I placed it inside. The flames didn't scream. They didn't rage. They accepted it, piece by piece, ash curling like tiny paper flowers. "I get it," I whispered. "You should have stood up. But I get it now." The wind shifted again, colder this time, and I wrapped my flannel tighter. When the fire calmed, I went inside. The cabin still smelled of pine and dust and quiet disappointment, but it also felt mine now. I started cleaning. Not furiously, not with purpose, just cleaning. I polished the old fishing hooks that hung on the wall, found a cracked photo frame with no picture inside. I dusted the bookshelf, ran my fingers over titles my father must have read. Steinbeck, Cormac McCarthy, a manual on boat engines from 1987. Then I found a chisel and a pocket knife in the drawer. I stood before the beam above the fireplace, the center of the room, and slowly began to carve. Not words, not initials, just a symbol. A small magnolia bloom. Not perfect, not symmetrical, but unmistakable. It felt right, like leaving a mark without asking permission. The wind howled outside as night folded in. I made tea. No dinner, just warmth. And then, as I set my cup down, my phone buzzed once. A message from Tessa. "I saw your sister today. She told me everything." I stared at the screen, thumb hovering. I didn't know what everything meant, but the ache in my ribs said it mattered. Maybe Amber had finally spoken the truth. Maybe she hadn't. But what mattered was this. Someone knew now. Not just what I'd lost, but what I'd chosen. The truck hummed low as I followed the winding road toward the river. This time, there was no tightness in my chest, no rehearsed answers, no dread curling around my ribs like wire, just a steady breath. And Tessa. She was waiting on an old bench near the bank, her jacket zipped to the chin, one leg crossed over the other, a folder tucked beneath her arm. I pulled up slowly, parked, and walked over. No words at first, just the sound of water moving, the wind brushing against magnolia petals scattered along the river's edge like snow. "You look taller," she said finally. "I might be," I said, sitting beside her. She handed me the folder. It was heavier than I expected. I opened it and there they were, my sketches, wireframes, handwritten notes from years ago. Versions of myself I had buried, all bound together in manila. "You kept these?" I asked. She smiled. "You emailed me half of it when we first worked together. I saved it just in case you remembered who you were." I let the pages flip. Diagrams of apps that organized family memories, audio archives, secure photo storage. All ideas born from someone who craved preservation, of time, of voice, of self. "I used to think I was building these for them," I said quietly. Tessa shook her head. "No, you built them to be heard." We sat for a long while. Ducks skimmed the water. The air was sharp but not cold. And then, "I never told you," I said. "What happened?" Tessa nodded once. "I figured you would when you were ready." I turned toward the river. "My dad burned my lottery check, $4.5 million. I told them I wouldn't share with Amber and he set it on fire, in front of me." Tessa didn't gasp. She didn't reach for my hand. She didn't interrupt. "I didn't scream, I didn't fight," I continued, and for a while I thought that made me weak. But now... I looked up, the magnolia petals drifting past us in the current. "I think I'm glad he did. It freed me. The money, it wasn't going to save me. Not from them. Not from myself." She exhaled. Not relief. Recognition. "They made your silence feel like weakness," she said softly. I nodded. "But it wasn't," she added. "It was survival." And that word, survival, landed like a stone in the river, rippling out, undeniable. We didn't talk much after that. She rested her head on my shoulder. I didn't flinch. Somewhere downstream, a child laughed. Leaves stirred on the surface, shifting like they had somewhere to be. "I'm going to launch the business," I said finally. "Under your real name?" "Yes." She leaned back and smiled. Not the kind you offer out of politeness, but the kind that sees you. All of you. You sure you're ready? No, I said. But I'm ready enough. We walked back to the truck in silence. When I dropped her off, she squeezed my hand once before stepping out. I waited until she disappeared into her brownstone before checking my phone. One new text. Ruth, you planning to show your face at Thanksgiving? I didn't respond. Not yet. Instead, I looked out the window at the river below the hill. A patch of wild magnolia petals, white, soft, wind-blown, rested gently against the tires. They had come from somewhere upstream, traveled far, and still, somehow, landed whole. I parked across the street from Ruth's house. The porch light was on, flickering like it always did in November wind. Through the front window, I saw movement. Shadows pacing, hands lifting platters, silverware catching the light. Thanksgiving. It used to mean canned cranberry and forced smiles. Now it meant choice. I stepped out, the gravel crunching under my boots. Leaves swirled along the sidewalk like they weren't sure which way to go. I knew the feeling. Inside, the house smelled like butter and sage and something faintly sweet. Pecan, maybe. The table was dressed in cream linen and polished forks. 8 seats, 7 filled. 1 left for me. I didn't knock. I didn't say hello. Just stepped in like I belonged. Because for the first time, I wasn't looking for permission. Ruth turned from the kitchen counter, a pie in her hand. Her expression didn't flicker. Still not over it? She said, setting the dish down without looking at me. My breath stayed steady. I glanced at the empty seat and walked toward it, then past it. I stopped at the head of the table and pulled something from my coat pocket. An envelope. I laid it on the table with quiet care, right between the candied yams and a gravy boat shaped like a turkey. Amber shifted in her chair. Dennis kept his head down. The rest pretended to be busy with their plates. Jack, over what? That you torched my check? Or that you taught me I was always worth less? Ruth's jaw clenched. She didn't reach for the envelope. Amber. Mom, just listen for once. No one moved. I pulled out the contents. A photo, grainy, pieced together with tape lines visible under the flash. The lottery check. The one I'd taken a picture of before it burned, not even knowing why. I held it up. This isn't about the money, I said, turning the photo toward Ruth. It's about who you made me believe I was, the afterthought, the spare seat, the one you used for balance but never noticed when it went missing. No one touched their forks. Ruth didn't cry, she didn't argue, but she didn't turn away either. And that, her silence, was more than I ever expected. It wasn't enough, but it was something. I placed the photo back in the envelope, tucked it inside my coat. Then I turned toward the door. Where are you going? Amber asked softly, rising. I showed up. That's enough for today. I didn't slam the door behind me, just closed it with the same care you'd give to a drawer that no longer quite fit. Outside, the cold air greeted me like an old friend. Honest, sharp. Footsteps followed. Amber. She caught up beside me, her coat only half buttoned, breath quick. I'm not here to stop you, she said. I know. We walked a few paces in silence. Would you ever... She started, then stopped. Would you ever want to build something together? I looked over. Not money, she added quickly. Just maybe something real. The question sat between us like a seed, unsure yet if it would grow. I nodded once. Maybe. When we reached the street corner, I turned to glance back at the house. Through the window, the dinner continued. Forks moved, mouths chewed. Ritual survived. But the seat I'd left behind, my seat, had something new. A single magnolia petal rested on the cushion, white and small and still, carried in from the wind, or maybe from something deeper. 6 months later, the cabin didn't look the same. The roof had been mended, the porch painted a soft gray. A hand-carved sign now hung from the gate, its letters etched deep and clean. The Magnolia Project, a place to start over. Amber stood beside me, her sleeves rolled up, dirt under her fingernails, eyes squinting into the soft morning sun. Spring had arrived in its quiet way. Early blossoms, clean skies, and that smell of wet soil promising second chances. "It's still strange," she said, watching a bird land on the cabin's gutter. "I keep thinking Mom's going to show up and ask if we're out of our minds." "She might," I said, smiling. "But I don't think she'll drive this far just to be disappointed." Amber laughed, soft and real. The kind I hadn't heard since we were kids, sitting in the back seat of Dad's old truck, sharing lemon drops and fighting over the radio. We turned our attention to the small hole we'd dug in the ground. A magnolia sapling sat in a burlap wrap nearby, its leaves full, its trunk thin but straight. Amber held it up and looked at me. "You ready?" I nodded. We placed it together, lowering it carefully into the earth. My hands pressed soil around the roots, her hands following. The dirt was damp and cool, clinging to our skin in silence. "We didn't get to choose our parents," Amber said after a while. I paused, then replied, "But we get to choose what we become. That's louder than blood." She wiped her hands on her jeans, took a step back, and stared at the little tree like it might already know how important it was. Behind us, the screen door creaked open. Tessa stepped out with a tray. 3 mugs, steam curling above them, and that steady smile of hers, the kind that didn't ask questions unless you offered answers. "Planting time?" she asked. "Planting and letting go," I said. She handed me a cup. I took it without hesitation. Funny thing, how I used to flinch from kindness, as if it might be a trick, as if warmth came with strings. But not here. Not anymore. Inside the cabin, the space had transformed. A bookshelf filled with paperbacks and journals, 2 single beds with quilts made by local women, a bulletin board with handwritten notes from guests we'd already welcomed. This place gave me breath again. Thank you for giving silence a voice. I didn't know strangers could feel like family. On the door, just above the handle, hung a plaque Amber had carved from old barnwood. Quiet is not the absence of pain, it's the sound of survival. The sun climbed higher. The magnolia sapling cast its first small shadow. Then we heard the crunch of tires. A car pulled into the gravel lot. An older man stepped out, maybe in his 70s, wearing a jacket too warm for spring and holding something in both hands. A small duffel bag and an envelope. He looked at the cabin, then at us. His face carried hesitation, the kind that comes from too many locked doors and too many people who said, "We don't do that here." "Hi," he called out, voice shaky but strong. "I read about this place, in a paper at a diner. Think there's room for someone like me?" Amber glanced at me. I nodded and took a step forward. "There's always room," I said. "That's kind of the point." He smiled. "Not all the way, but enough." Amber opened the door. Tessa poured another cup. I turned back to the magnolia we'd just planted. Its leaves caught the light like stained glass. Maybe it wouldn't bloom right away. Maybe some years it wouldn't bloom at all. But it would grow, on its own terms, like we all deserved to. Family doesn't always mean fairness, and love isn't always loud. But healing begins when we stop waiting for apologies to set us free. Sometimes, the real power is in choosing who we become after the pain. Financial independence and emotional clarity often go hand in hand. And most of all, quiet isn't weakness. It's survival. It's strength. It's the soil where something better can grow. If this story touched your heart, consider liking the video and subscribing to our channel. We share more stories just like this, quiet, real, and deeply human. You never know. The next one might speak directly to your own journey.